Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Can you hold an election in a war zone? President Assad of Syria thinks you can. He's just announced that presidential elections will go ahead despite the conflict which continues to rage throughout the country. The UN reckons the elections will damage an already weak peace process. Critics say the elections are a regime stitch-up, even though there's a provision for voters to choose between multiple candidates. And in any case, isn't Syria's future likely to be settled more by bullets than ballots? In the studio to discuss the latest events are Hassan Helmi, who's a human rights activist, Nabal Istanbuli, who's manager of the UK office of the Syrian National Coalition, and Paul Schult, who's senior research fellow at King's College London. But first, let's take a look at this report.
As Syria enters its fourth year of war, the violence shows no signs of slowing down. This weekend, there has been fierce fighting in Aleppo as armed groups step up their campaign in the north, a strategically important location that would cut off government supply routes if the rebels had control. The rebels are advancing in Aleppo and are not far away from Air Force Intelligence headquarters. But even though the rebels are making gains in the north, it appears they are suffering setbacks in the south. Yesterday, government troops recaptured the mainly Christian town of Malula, northeast of the capital Damascus, which was taken by rebels last December. President Bashar al-Assad has said that the civil war is turning in his favour and that his government has announced that there is no intention of delaying presidential elections despite the raging civil war in the country. UN Arab peace envoy Lakhdar Brahimi has expressed concern that pushing ahead with presidential elections would jeopardise international peacemaking efforts that have so far resulted in 2 rounds of talks in Switzerland, but no concrete steps forward. But government officials see no contradiction between staging the vote and efforts to hold peace talks and have been busy trying to convince Syrians and the world that the coming elections will be democratic and that significant reforms have been made to ensure this. They refer to the new electoral law that was passed on the 17th of March that allows for multiple candidates, yet critics point out Section 30 of the same law, which they say proves that no significant reform has been made. Section 30 states that anyone who stands must have at least 35 members of parliament supporting them and have been resident in the country for the past 10 years, and that both parents must be Syrian. And electors must hold a new identification document which can only be issued by regime authorities, and that those who have fled Syria since the war began will not be able to vote unless they left via an official border point. Critics believe that all of these restrictions mean that Assad's main opponents will not be able to take part in the election and that he has ensured his own victory under the veneer of democracy.
So, Paul, I mean, even if this set of elections weren't taking place in a war-torn country, it looks like a stitch-up, doesn't it? It doesn't look as if there's been any real significant constitutional change here.
I think that's true. And if you look at the whole history of Syria since the Baathists began to take power in 63 and then 70, there's never been any attempt to pretend that it was more than a Baathist system of nomination. Only the Assads were on the list. What's happening now is a very faint pretense at opening this, that there could be another candidate, but he'd have to be approved and meet all those conditions. So it's a very half-hearted, fluttering attempt to pretend that they've become slightly more democratic.
I mean, Sam, it does look from those qualifications, even if you say there's going to be multiple candidates and then list all those qualifications. I mean, there's only kind of one more qualification you could make, really, and that's your name has to be Assad.
Actually, it's a fake legislation. They change it. Like, if you look back at the history of Syria, Paul said, when Bashar al-Assad came to the power, in 5 minutes in the parliament they changed the legislation to change the age of the president from 40 to 36. So now they're doing the same things, but in a way that show the world that we are changing. But actually, people refusing you. They don't want you. So is this not true? It's a fake.
Well, I mean, even if this was the fairest election in the world, it couldn't be run in Syria with the conditions that exist at the moment, could it?
Yeah, no way it can't be run in Syria, because we are talking about we are now talking about millions of people who have fled out of the country and millions who are displaced inside the country. I think that the whole number of the displaced people are now about 9 million. So who gonna? They won't be able to to vote. They all against Assad. This first of all. Another thing, we've got more than quarter a million of martyrs. And can you imagine themselves? And when I'm talking about them as a Syrian, and can you imagine their families as well? So what kind of, and in this situation, I think that even like if it's a kind of political issue or crisis, you can't do elections in such a circumstances. What about like a war nowadays in Syria? It's kind of fight.
They literally won't be able to run a ballot in rebel-held areas, will they?
Definitely, they all gonna do is just like run the elections in areas which are controlled by Syrian regime, and then they would like to say that look, we ran the elections and we won it, and this is it. This is the dictatorship who will force every single person to vote for his name, and then will win the elections. I'll give just a small example. I think almost a year and a half they ran the parliamentary elections, and on the Syrian TV, the regime TV, one woman went out saying that, okay, I'm happy with these elections, and because I'm happy with the regime, I voted on behalf of my two sons who lives abroad. So you can imagine, and it was reported on their TV, in the regime TV. This is how regime behave.
And Sam, I mean, when it says that only people who left the country through the official border posts, presumably that means the vast majority of people who are refugees certainly didn't leave that way, and presumably the people who did leave that way are more likely to be regime supporters.
So it could be like some people fled the country, let's say legally from the border, especially those from Damascus to Lebanon. But anyway, those who left from the border illegally, let's say they don't have a document, then how they will vote? Is there it will be like a box for voting in the Zaatari camp? And is there will be any also one in Turkey or in Lebanon for those people who really suffer from this regime? They are displaced, their places, their houses, families killed. So those people, if we listen to their voice, then the result will be really accurate, and then we will see the outcome of that. If it is really political, but it's not.
Okay. So, Paul, I mean, really what we're saying is that however, regrettably, we're a long way from anything significant changing in Syria because of a ballot. Yeah. So, when it comes down to the bullets, it also looks like it's a stalemate still, doesn't it?
It's not changing fast, but the general impression of military commentators is that it is somewhat changing in favour of the regime. The national coalition is divided. There are all these other fringe extreme Islamist parties who are fighting it and each other. And the Russians appear to be stepping up supplies of weapons to the Assad regime, and there's probably some connection between this and events in the Ukraine. It's a way of Russia saying we're not going to be constrained anymore by what America and the West thinks. So, unfortunately, from the point of view of a democratic transition, the kinds of things the UN has called for, the military tide may be going the other way and may be encouraging Assad to push this. I mean, there is some combination of bullets and ballots, because the interesting question about this election is not who will win it, but
how much they'll win it by.
Not even that, but it's how much the Russians and the Iranians will try and use this as a fig leaf to argue for the political legitimacy of the Assad regime. Everybody knows that the main determinants will be fighting on the ground, but there is this other war going on in capitals in the UN, on websites as a kind of information struggle, and it connects with the question of guilt for the chemical attacks, and it's about the whole legitimacy of the regime and the reasonableness of its friends Iran and Russia to go on supporting it against the
Well,
opposition.
we'll come back to some of those issues that you raised there, but I guess you'd have a different picture of the struggle on the ground.
Yeah, definitely, because like on the ground there are many advances achieved by the Free Syrian Army, especially in Aleppo, the city, and even like in Latakia suburbs. So we are doing very well, where they are fighting and gaining many small villages and cities nowadays, and I think that they are putting huge pressure over Hezbollah militia and even all the militias fighting with the Iraqi militias fighting for Assad's regime benefit, and even for the Syrian regime army. This is the first thing. And another thing we want, please don't forget that on the other hand, they are fighting against like ISIS as well, like in Raqqa and many other areas. So yeah, they are suffering. It's not easy to overcome the Assad's regime forces, but they are doing very well, and I think that they are making some advances. But I agree with Paul, because we can't see like one army overcoming the other one, because they've got both have got like suppliers who won't stop providing them with weapons. That's why we're looking for a kind of political solution which forces Assad's regime, because of the overcome of the Free Syrian Army, to step back. And just today, I think that there were an initiative by France to send Assad to the International Criminal Court. So, yeah, maybe.
Sam, what's your take on the? We've had two opposed views here about what the balance of the military struggle is. What's your estimation?
I think if we look at the military things inside Syria, it's a battle. Like a regime wins some places, and then the Free Syrian Army and the other group win other places, and it's ongoing for how long? We don't know. You never know who will win. It depends on the supply, let's say, of the weapons. Who got more supply, maybe got more, but at some point they stop it for the rebels, and then it's like this. So they use it as a game for maybe ongoing for years and years, and this is not gonna finish if it stay like this. So the issue is to stop all this supply for both parties, for the Assad regime first, and then for the rebel, then both of them, stop all this making Syria as a war ground. It's gonna be Somali. It's gonna be for 30 years. Otherwise, we won't finish. So we should go back to negotiation, to be solution, let's say, to democratic solution, let's say, from the international world, to put more pressure on the Assad regime, on Russia, on China, on all these countries to stop supplying Assad. And at the same time, in Geneva, the opposition did very well, actually, in terms of political. They gained some political things in that, but the regime tried to play around with it. Okay. Always.
Well, in that international framework, I mean, the UN representative said that the announcement of the elections may damage the peace process. Yeah. Do you think that's likely, or do you think that really it's not going to have much effect?
I think on balance, and it won't be a big effect, it will embitter the situation. It will make the opposition more sceptical about talking to a regime which is doing something which is such an obviously deceitful charade. So there's almost no trust and optimism at the moment, and there'll be that much less of it now.
And more widely about, Sam raises the question of, of the various sort of people who've got an interest in this as a proxy war standing out of it. Do you think that's liable to happen? I mean, it looked to me as if Obama's visit to Saudi Arabia, for instance, was really to kind of calm them, because there wasn't an attack by the Western powers on Syria, not to restrain them particularly.
I don't think he can restrain them. I think Saudi and Qatar will go on sending materials in. The interesting thing is whether the Americans are going to send more. That they are not providing the absolutely valued weapons that the opposition's asked for, anti-tank, advanced anti-tank weapons, and above all anti-aircraft weapons. So the Americans are very, very cautious in what they're giving because they're afraid of things getting into the hands of extreme Islamists. I don't think the Russians and the Iranians are controllable at all. I can't think of any kind of appeal to them that would, certainly not a humanitarian one, unfortunately, that is likely to make any difference.
Okay, so I mean, if things aren't likely to get better, and I guess what Paul's saying, I guess what many commentators would say is that the kind of the armourers of both sides aren't going to step out of this, but there is a possibility they might be stepping more fully into this as a result of things elsewhere. Paul's already suggested that perhaps the situation in the Ukraine is going to make the Russians more likely to arm the regime. Do you think it's more likely to make, Nabel, do you think it's more likely that the Americans in response will therefore come up with the weapons for the rebels?
Yeah, we hope so, but I think that up to now, as Paul mentioned, that the American aids to arm the Free Syrian Army are limited, so we need anti-aircrafts, we need anti-tanks. This is what the Free Syrian Army needs to make advances over the Syrian regime, because without the aircrafts that Syrian regime uses, without Scud missiles, without the very bad shelling, the Free Syrian Army would have won the battle long time ago. And this is the main thing. And another thing, yes, we are afraid. We are a bit like afraid of the extremists in Syria, but we are more afraid about the international intervention in Syria, which means, because it's a part of it, the Iraqi intervention, which supports the Iraqi militia supporting Assad's regime, fighting for them on the ground, and Hezbollah militia, which states directly that, very obviously, that yeah, they intervene in Syria. So I think that more political pressure should be put even in on Russia to stop providing and arming the Syrian regime.
But I mean, Sam, that's a blown prospect, isn't it? The situation in Ukraine has zeroed the chance of the Russians being pressured into not arming the Assad regime.
But this is good if the international community tried to use that situation, let's say, to put more pressure on Russia to stop arming the Syrian regime and with arms and with military people who can train his soldiers. So it will be very good if they put that pressure on the regime, because that could maybe at some point they will think about it or not. I'm not sure if they will think.
But who is the international community? Who is there that isn't speaking to the Russians about Ukraine and they're not listening about that? Who would it be that would be a new voice that would change Putin's calculations?
Well, let's just...
Unfortunately, there's no new voice nowadays, and I think that the international community just left Russia do whatever they would like to in Ukraine. They left without saying anything. They didn't put any pressure over Russia. That's why this makes it I think strengthen the Russian intervention inside Syria, because they've been given the green light in Russia.
Which was giving special mention to China, which is playing a completely unconstructed role.
But the problem here is, there was always a degree of fiction about the term international community. But what we've really seen in recent years is that, unlike the Iraq War, unlike the Afghan War, the rest of the major powers even can't be disciplined by the United States any longer. So what was always something of a fiction is now more or less a dead duck, isn't it, Paul?
But I think that the international community can put big pressure and force Assad's regime to do what they would like to do. Because I can give you two examples.
Yeah, but I think Paul's point is that when you say international community, there ain't one.
It's USA, even the European Union, but we can remember that.
Well, let's investigate that, because I'm quite interested in this, because there clearly is a dynamic now beginning to develop, and perhaps, Paul, you'd like to tell us how much of a dynamic you think this is, how much traction it's already got between the Ukraine and the Syrian situation. Because I mean, on one possible reading of what both of you have suggested might happen, that pressure might be put on Russia via the Ukraine. I mean, there's one other scenario here, which is that Ukraine starts looking like Syria.
Yeah. I think behind both cases, you have a Russia which seems to be very interested in showing it's not going to be pushed around, and that it will not let its friends be pushed around. Whether that's dissident so-called locals in eastern Ukraine or in the Crimea, or whether it's the Assad regime, Putin's policy, his strategy in the world, seems to be about building up Russia as a tough country that's not going to be pushed around anymore and won't let its clients be pushed around. And so in both, these reinforce each other. In order to succeed in the Ukraine, he wants to look tough in Syria and vice versa. In every case, it seems to be a consistent Russian approach that they're just not interested in moral constraints or complaints from the so-called international community, which mostly means the West, because back to China, China has also threatened to veto UN resolutions over Syria, which would embarrass the Assad regime. So there's a kind of authoritarian versus liberal democratic split in the world, and there's also, interestingly, a Sunni-Shia split, given the Iranian position, and these two splits are kind of intertwining.
Well, leaving aside on which side of that divide the United States stands, Sam, don't you worry that if you urge a course of action which is to put pressure on the Russians over the Ukraine, that what you'll end up with is Syria and the Ukraine? In other words, you'll have two intractable, perhaps proxy wars going on, and you will have doubled the misery, not solved one set of miseries.
I hope, the world learned from the crisis in Syria, not doing same things, same mistakes in Ukraine. And I don't think so Europe will let Ukraine by itself like what they left Syria, because it's very close to Europe. So in this case, they might give more power, put more pressure, use their policy, use their power, anything to stop it in Ukraine. I don't think so it's going to be like Syria, because nothing like Syria, to be honest. And we're missing something in the discussion, like the third things that can put pressure, the people who have the power, that they can put pressure on their government, like in the Europe, in the USA. So the power of the people. This can stop also the war in Syria and everywhere.
Okay, well, let's have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because we're just coming up to the break. But we'll be looking at the role of citizen journalists in the Syrian conflict after the break, so do rejoin us. Thank you. Thank you.